As I said, my name is John Pfeffer, and I work with the Institute for Policy Studies, which is a think tank located in Washington, D.C., and I direct the Global Just Transition Project, and we also have within our project something called the Rare Earth Elements Group, or RE Group, which is focused on rare earth elements and critical minerals, and many of our group members are joining us today for a discussion of the Trump administration's policies. It obviously has been a tumultuous year in many respects across the foreign policy realm, across questions of energy transition and mineral policy. And we're going to focus today on his mineral policies and with a focus as well on rare earth elements and what has changed in U.S. policy. And I am delighted to be joined by two experts on these issues. And Melinda St. Louis is the director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. And before she was at Public Citizen, she was a policy director at Jubilee USA Network and also the executive director of Witness for Peace. So she brings a lot of great experience to her work on trade issues, and she's going to give us a update on mineral policy in general. And I'm also delighted to be joined by Raquel Dominguez, and she's the circular economy policy advocate at Earthworks, and that has involved a lot of work on recycling and reuse, but she also has a great deal of expertise on rare earth elements as well. So both Melinda and Raquel are going to kick off this conversation with short presentations, and then we'll have a kind of a conversation among ourselves with some questions and responses. But we also have a Q&A function that is enabled for you as well to put your questions there. We'll start integrating your questions as quickly as we can into this conversation. We also have a chat mode that you can kind of put your comments in real time. But I'd ask you to reserve your questions for the Q&A. So, Melinda, we're going to start with you. I understand you have a slideshow, and so I'll let you share your screen and we'll get started.
Great. Can you see it?
Absolutely.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much, John, and IPS for hosting this webinar. My name is Melinda St. Louis. As you mentioned, I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to share some of the work that we've been doing with partners here in Washington and around the world related to the critical mineral supply chains. Now, I just want to maybe begin by saying kind of what I am going to talk about and what I'm not. There is a lot around minerals policy domestically that I am not going to be focused on. So I would be happy to, have that come out in the discussion if that is of interest. But what we at Global Trade Watch have been working on for the past few years is trying to ensure that our U.S. trade policy contributes to a just transition and not and doesn't exacerbate an extractivist supply chain around critical minerals. So just to start, this was. We actually started to organize a table of interested organizations during the Biden administration, and after the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, there was a provision in the Inflation Reduction Act related to the tax incentives for electric vehicles that pointed to critical minerals being sourced from countries that had a free trade agreement with the United States. So that was something that was included in that legislation. And so then there became kind of a scramble to sign critical minerals trade agreements related in order for electric vehicles and batteries to qualify for the IRA subsidies. And so the Biden administration started negotiating critical minerals agreements. The first one was with Japan, and it happened kind of overnight without real scrutiny, oversight, and there were a lot of concerns that a number of organizations raised with the administration, because this was basically pushing for a critical minerals agreement, incentivizing bringing those minerals without strong standards to ensure that we were pushing for high road mining and processing. And that's, as I'm sure folks know on this call, there are widely documented human rights abuses throughout the mineral supply chain, including displacement of indigenous peoples, forced labor, environmental destruction. So, I think there was a real concern even during the Biden years that while, as we the attempt to transition to a clean energy economy, it matters the way we go about getting those minerals, and that environmental justice demands that we fight for accountability, transparency, and the highest of standards in any trade, investment, or other agreement that's related to supply chains of critical minerals. But so then now, transitioning to Trump, we now obviously are facing a climate hostile administration, even more so. I mean, I'm not to paint the Biden administration in too rosy a brush, but obviously we are now, facing not even the patina of climate concerns. But the push for critical minerals has only intensified. Under Trump, now the rationale is given from the green transition, we're no longer talking about that, even, to basically a blunt acknowledgement that minerals are needed for tech dominance, particularly in the AI sphere, and for military applications. And what Trump has begun to do is use his tariffs as leverage to pursue opaque trade negotiations with dozens of countries, that not even specifying which ones they are, to secure various kinds of deals around critical minerals. So in January of this year, Trump issued an executive order that directed the U.S. Trade Representative to initiate and to complete negotiations around critical minerals. As I mentioned, this was already happening in a number of different deals, but this signified an increase to push for such deals, and to for the U.S. Trade Representative, in addition to the State Department, to the Department of Commerce, and others, to be pushing for these critical minerals trade agreements. And then in February, the State Department hosted a minerals ministerial. They hosted 50 countries to discuss having frameworks and agreements related to having U.S. access to critical minerals. They announced deals with 10 of the countries that participated in that ministerial that I have on this slide: Argentina, Cook Islands, Ecuador, Guinea, Morocco, Paraguay, Peru, Philippines, UAE, Uzbekistan. These were bilateral. There were frameworks or memos of understanding that were announced. But what we're seeing, and I just wanted to kind of create this kind of constellation, and this is what's hard to try to suss out right now, right, are the different types of minerals deals that we're seeing. So there are these memoranda of understanding, and framework agreements. Those look to be largely non-binding, kind of just statements of we agree to X, but there's no kind of enforcement mechanism, etc. So we've seen those with Thailand, the UK, some of the ones that I mentioned before. Australia, there is a framework agreement, again, non-binding action plans have been announced also with Mexico, the EU, and Japan. Those are also appear to be largely non-binding. And then we have seen some binding agreements that have been negotiated. And I mean, what we've seen, part of what we are seeing here, like with everything in the Trump administration, are like headline grabbing announcements with deals that actually aren't really final and that not much is going to come of them. So those, again, the memoranda of understanding, the frameworks, they're generally loose agreements to supposedly work together to facilitate mining of minerals. But then, as I mentioned, he's been using tariffs as leverage to make deals. And one set of those deals that we've seen are minerals for security that we're kind of calling with the Ukraine. Trump conditioned military resources to the Ukraine in exchange for preferential access to their minerals in a deal. For the Democratic Republic of Congo, Trump has claimed to bring peace to the bloody DRC Rwanda conflict. With the leaders of both countries, came to Washington last June to sign what was a so-called peace deal. And at the time, Trump explicitly stated that the peace would open up more access to DRC's minerals, saying that everyone will make a lot of money on the minerals. And as he was announcing the peace deal, and then the United States separately negotiated and signed a strategic partnership agreement with the DRC, specifically on critical minerals. And that was concluded in December. It's important to note that the fighting and violence has continued unabated in Eastern Congo, despite the so-called peace deal. And yet there is now this binding security partnership agreement or strategic partnership agreement on minerals that the United States has with the DRC. And then there are these agreements on reciprocal trade, is what they're calling them. It's Trump's version of a free trade agreement that was based on negotiating around the reciprocal tariffs that he announced last year exactly a year ago, yesterday. And countries were racing to try to make deals to maybe lower some of the tariffs that had been announced. And they're very unequal deals that have been negotiated completely in secret, no oversight. And so these are some of them: Argentina, Bangladesh, Cambodia, El Salvador, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Taiwan. And these include some provisions around critical minerals as well. So those are binding trade agreements that have minerals provisions, among other things. And then, with this administration, it's difficult to be shocked by anything. But recently, the New York Times reported a new low that a State Department memo stated that the administration was considering withholding HIV medicines and other life-saving medical aid from Zambia to pressure the country to make a deal with the United States around critical minerals. That was, a total outrage. In less than a week, we worked with more than 90 organizations to send a letter slamming this notion. And State Department spokesman then lashed out at the groups that sent the letter. They called us predictably woke groups and that George Soros funded, blah, blah, blah. But they did not deny the contents of the memo or confirm that the State Department would not engage in such craven, cruel behavior to push for a critical minerals deal. So that's kind of the map of the deals. And then what's in them? And as I mentioned, this has been a very opaque process, very difficult to figure out what's actually happening in the deals. No congressional oversight. But as the texts are becoming available, we're beginning to see that, as we feared, they include binding terms that rob developing countries of the economic benefit of their resources, and they incentivize a new wave of dangerous and dirty mining with basically no meaningful labor and environmental standards. We've seen in some of the deals, there's fast tracking of permitting for mining, et cetera. That's another thing, obviously, we're seeing here in the United States, kind of the push to fast track permitting, to overcome, kind of environmental obstacles, et cetera. There are promises of investment from the United States as kind of part of but those are non-binding provisions around kind of the promises of investment. But there are binding restrictions on using industrial policy tools, like any sort of export restrictions, like what Indonesia has successfully used with nickel mining to try to get more value add in their supply chain with their minerals. Indonesia agreed to largely get rid of that. Malaysia agreed to have no restrictions on exports of their critical minerals in their agreement. And then very worryingly, we've seen, like, for example, in the DRC deal, there's a right of first offer for U.S. mining companies. So, there's sovereignty has been completely thrown out the window. There's actually a kind of a steering committee set up that includes U.S. cabinet members who decide with the Congolese government which concessions are made available, like, of their land. They just are part of the decision making of what concessions are made available, and that then there is a right of first offer for U.S. mining companies for those concessions, and then they can include tax and regulatory breaks for U.S. mining companies, and as I mentioned, no meaningful labor, environmental, human rights standards. Interestingly, some of them do mention actually like banning forced labor, but there's no enforcement mechanism in these in terms of that. So they have some goodish language around labor, very little on environment, but none of it is binding, and obviously nothing around indigenous rights or human rights standards, etc. And now, last month, they announced potentially a multi-country plurilateral critical minerals deal that they wanted to negotiate with a number of countries. And that is, they opened up, we don't know really anything about that, except that there was a comment period that was opened last month to solicit input on such a deal. The plurilateral deal that they're considering would have price floors for the minerals traded within the block of kind of the coalition of the willing that sign up to this plurilateral deal. So that is something that we don't have information about, but that they said they were seeking input for. And then, and so given all of this, I just want to end by mentioning that there is this table of groups, more than 35 civil society organizations that have been working on sustainability, mining standards, indigenous rights, and justice for frontline communities, tracking and responding to international negotiations. And we submitted recommendations to Congress. There's the Seek Institute, Thriving Economy, had a request for information that we provided these to, as well as to the comment period. And, we are calling for strong binding labor, environmental, human rights, indigenous rights standards with swift and certain enforcement. If there's any critical minerals deals, we need to have policies, incentivize sustainable development, job creation, mineral circularity, and a transparent process with congressional review and approval, which is required by our Constitution. So those are some, we can share those letters. And then just to, we have a number of resources around cobalt mining in Congo, nickel mining in Indonesia, as well as memos around the DRC deal, the Indonesia and Malaysia deals, and have been kind of continuing to try to raise awareness about this in Congress. There were 50 members of Congress in August signed a letter led by Representative Sanchez demanding transparency in the DRC negotiations that was completely ignored. And then they announced the deal. So we're working with some members of Congress to to be pushing back on not just the process but also the substance of these deals and to exercise their authority. Congress has the constitutional authority over trade, and they're just completely abdicating that. So I'll leave it there.
Excellent. Thank you, Melinda. That was fabulous. And I would ask if you could maybe put some of those links in the chat for people as to some of those specific reports, because that they also contain incredibly valuable information. So now we're going to turn to Raquel Dominguez. Thank you again, Raquel, for joining us. And just a reminder, Raquel is the Circular Economy Policy Advocate. That's Circular Economy Policy Advocate at Earthworks, another fabulous organization working on these issues. I'm going to pass it over to you, Raquel. Do you also have a PowerPoint or no?
I do not. I jotted down a bunch of notes, so I will skim through those. I have links, and so I can put some of those in the chat after I'm done, and then I can also clean this up and send it along with the recording if that would be helpful. Hi everyone, I'm Raquel. I use she, her pronouns, and I have been at Earthworks for about 6 years. For those of you who have not gotten a million emails from us, Earthworks is a US-based organization that supports communities on the front lines of oil, gas, and what we call in the US hard rock mineral extraction. And hard rock minerals are just things that are under the ground that aren't energy minerals. So cobalt, lithium, platinum, rare earths, all of the stuff that we're here to talk about today. So I'm going to run through some notes I took down. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A and I will get to them. I'm not sure what people know about rare earths, so I'm going to just start with some really broad stuff, which is that they are 17 elements on the periodic table. Sorry, I'm going to close the chat because I'm easily distracted. They are not actually rare. The term rare earth elements comes from I think it's an 18th century term when they could not measure most things. But the name has stuck, which gives it this air of scarcity. They're essential for specialized magnets used in energy storage, technology, EV batteries, and turbines. Their other uses include ammunition, aeronautics, drones, catalytic converters, battery cells, lasers, and satellites, as well as permanent magnets for like turbines and X-ray tubes. All 17, but promethium are relatively plentiful, but they're not in economically viable concentrations. They're like largely scattered. They're connected with critical minerals due to China's near monopoly on them. Currently, China mines 63% of all rare earth elements, but 10 years ago, it was 97%. It is worth noting that China has suffered severe environmental degradation in the areas where they mine and process rare earths. And in the last 20-ish years, they have made an active effort to push rare earth element extraction into other countries so they can import the minerals themselves and process them and then manufacture them into batteries and whatnot. And they are extremely dangerous to mine and process because they are mostly co-located with uranium and thorium, which are, of course, both radioactive. So they produce lots of really, really dangerous waste. And I'm not going to go too in depth into tailings, which are mining wastes, but tailings are really, really dangerous. They have to be monitored forever, and they are often radioactive and otherwise hazardous. They can leak into water, soil, etc. One metric ton of rare earth elements produces 60,000 cubic meters of waste gas containing hydrochloric acid, 200 cubic meters of acid containing sewage water, and 1 to 1.4 metric tons of radioactive waste. Because they're so much more damaging to extract and process than even critical minerals, and critical minerals and mining in general is it's extremely destructive. Um, but because our rare earths are even more so, they should be prioritized for equitable civilian use. And they should be targeted for research and development on substitution and reduction. So kind of a similar case study is how cobalt is being rapidly reduced out of batteries because of the human rights violations in the DRC. And so I think last year or 2024, most Tesla batteries were produced with no cobalt, which is big. And so it's possible. The Department of Energy has actually built rare earth-free magnets using bismuth and manganese. Let's see here. Moving on to these quote trade deals, and I won't use air quotes every time, but please assume that I am using air quotes. They really have more in common with extortion than normal trade policy, as Melinda detailed in her presentation. I really recommend reading some of the public citizen memos on some of the trade deals. The most recent one, I believe, is the Indonesia deal from February. And it is just it's bananas. And that's compared to even normal US trade policy, which was far from equitable, to be clear. I'm going to talk specifically about the kind of the like conquest rhetoric around Greenland. It's important to note, and I think it is really lost in most conversations about Greenland, is that it is already a colonial holding of Denmark, and there has been a push for independence in Greenland for, I mean, as long as it's been a colonial holding, but it's been really renewed in the last 10, 5-ish years. It's a very complicated discussion. I am not an expert in it, but I do think that is a really important point to make whenever we're talking about Greenland. They had a ban on uranium mining from, oh gosh, I want to say the 70s through 2013, and then it was repealed. And then it was re-implemented in 2021, meaning currently uranium mining is banned in Greenland. And because rare earths are co-products often of uranium, that de facto bans that de facto bans rare earth mining. A lot of rare earth mining companies are very unhappy about this, and one of them is suing Greenland in Denmark for over $1 billion. I don't remember which one off the top of my head, but it's pretty dramatic. So that's where a lot of the enthusiasm comes from in terms of this push to conquer Greenland. Um, it's just straight up extraction. And then shifting a bit to Ukraine. In 2022, a representative of Ukraine's government said that 5% of the world's critical raw materials are in Ukraine, including, quote, significant rare earth deposits. I do want to note that the geological surveys to which this representative was referring are several decades old, and they were done during the USSR. So it's been a while. But I mean, they've used the same rhetoric when talking about the DRC Rwanda deal and Ukraine. They've said that, we will establish peace or whatever if you give us your critical minerals. And I think it is also worth noting that the Biden administration, and I'm not trying to pass judgment one way or the other, did seek out critical minerals ostensibly and publicly for the purpose of transition of the climate transition, particularly for EVs. That was, of course, their main focus in terms of climate stuff. And the Trump administration obviously is not even pretending. Uh, like Melinda said, there's not even a patina. Um, and so we should assume that however and wherever this administration gets quote critical minerals, energy transition materials, whatever, um, they're probably for military purposes, especially with multiple wars either happening or likely to happen. Um, Couple more things. This is not trade deal related specifically, but since July 2025, the administration has committed several $100 million to four rare earth companies operating projects in the US. And these are MP Materials, USA Rare Earth Inc., Vulcan Elements, and ReElement Technologies. Worth noting, these are not the only companies the administration has taken equity stakes in the last, it's not even been 2 years. But all of these four companies, they have serious conflicts of interest, including the president, one of the president's sons is involved in one of them. The Department of Energy's sons, plural, is involved in another one. Public Citizen, again, put out an excellent report detailing the corruption, particularly in the hard rock mining industry. Highly recommend reading that as well. It will just blow you away. And recovering 1% of critical minerals byproducts from currently operating domestic mines will substantially reduce our foreign dependence for most materials, including rare earth elements, according to a 2025 article. And then this last bit I want to emphasize is speculation. I think it's fairly grounded speculation, but nothing has been confirmed. As more troops get equipped and deployed wherever, in Iran, potentially in Venezuela, wherever, I think it is very likely that there will be a lot more rhetoric about the importance of stockpiling critical minerals, including rare earths. And that is actually based on in World War II, that's when the United States first started stockpiling what we now call critical minerals. Other military uses include lanthanum for night vision goggles, neodymium for laser range finders, guidance systems, and communications. And a third one I cannot pronounce is essential for precision guiding munitions. And then last thing I promise is I think it is possible that we see rare earth element and rare earth element extraction advocates and nuclear advocates join forces to say it's important to do more uranium mining, on whether it's under the guise of we need more rare earth elements or under the guise of we need nuclear energy for the transition. That's it for me. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Raquel. That was a wonderful presentation. And it's fascinating hearing the two of you talk back to back. Among other things, we get the message that the United States under the Trump administration is fine with industrial policy in the United States when it comes to, say, investing in rare earth element companies, but using trade deals to discourage or in some cases ban industrial policy in other countries. And it would be interesting to kind of dig down into that and see, in fact, the character of this emerging industrial policy of the Trump administration, distinct from what the Biden administration attempted with the IRA, and the degree to which countries are really following through on their pledges to stop industrial policy, or whether they're continuing industrial policy under different names, because I can't imagine that countries will give up their sovereign right to determine investments so easily in a trade agreement environment. So think about that. But first, Krista Shenham has a really excellent question about the Supreme Court decision recently, or relatively recently, on Trump's authority to impose his tariffs. Now, of course, although the Supreme Court made that determination, Trump immediately found some other spurious legal justification for imposing another 15% tariff across the board. But this kind of high level back and forth between, say, the Supreme Court and the Trump administration attempting to find legal justifications for its tariff policies, has it had any impact so far on the negotiation of these trade agreements, both the ones that were already signed during the the illegal era, as according to the Supreme Court, or others going forward?
Yeah, no, I mean it's an excellent question, I, and I think like with everything with this administration is we're kind of like in unprecedented times. So kind of figuring out what, and legality doesn't really matter so much for this administration. So it's really, in some ways, it's really about how the other countries respond and react. The we as public citizen and in solidarity with groups around the world, civil society groups, I mean, we've been saying that for, trying to encourage civil society to urge their governments to not sign up to these unequal bias deals, given that the authority around the tariffs was, shaky legally at best. And now with the Supreme Court ruling, we know that they were illegal. The administration came out very quickly to say, oh, the deals still stand. I think the reason countries signed these deals is because they were afraid, and also because they wanted to, curry favor with Trump so that he wouldn't come down harder on them. Because I mean, the other thing about these deals is that they are, they're not binding in the sense that the countries did not get ironclad guarantees that their tariff rate will only be X. He could still raise the tariffs again, according to the way the deals are written. So they're so unequal and terrible. I think you are correct that the administration basically is trying to send the message to those countries that we will find a way to do these tariffs. We don't care enough about the law and the legal authorities. The next authority that they're using will work its way through the courts too. But then they also have launched a series of Section 301 and 232 investigations. So that's a very broad tariff authority as well. They have to jump through more hoops. They have to do these investigations, but they're claiming that they're going to do so within the 5-month period of this other authority that he invoked due to balance of payments. So it's really, what other countries think that he can do. For example, Malaysia they made some very strong statements that they didn't think that their ART, their Agreement on Reciprocal Trade, what should stand after the Supreme Court ruling. So we're feeling like, yes, let's embolden countries to say that, to do that, to not implement them. And for most of these other countries, they haven't been ratified. They need to ratify the agreements. In the United States, they're claiming they don't need to ratify them. They don't need to go through Congress because the U.S. hasn't really made any commitments. All the commitments are on the side of the other countries. And so they have to ratify them. But in Malaysia, for example, there's been a lot of opposition. In the DRC, huge opposition in the parliament there. So I think one of the things we've been trying to do is to encourage other countries to stand up to not implement these unequal deals, to not agree to them, because just kind of in terms of appeasing the bully is not the way to he just asks for more, and that's what we've seen with a lot of the deals that have been signed. Even with like Canada and the EU, they've made concessions, and then he's just kind of come back and said he wants more.
Excellent. Well, let's follow up on that, on this question of pushback, because of course, so far you've emphasized, for the most part, both of you, the countries that have been eager for a variety of different reasons to negotiate with the Trump administration, to curry favor because they're in a vulnerable situation, like Ukraine, for instance, or they're just a small country in general,
Mhm.
and they don't have a lot of choices. But what kind of instances of pushback, or even just attempts at negotiating better deals, better from the perspective of the other country, have we seen? I mean, Raquel, of course, you mentioned Greenland has the ban on uranium mining, and so that does function to a certain extent as a limit. But do we have other examples that can serve as a template, for instance, of resistance to these bullying tactics of the Trump administration?
Um, Raquel, you want to
No,
start?
please go ahead.
Okay. Um, so I mean, we have seen, I mean, there are instances kind of outside of the minerals space that we've seen. I mean, it's pretty interesting to note. I mean, obviously, China is in a different position, but China has really been the only country that basically just retaliated and said, and Trump basically backed down. I mean, he claimed that he didn't, but I mean, all that we're basically back to what the situation was before the tariffs were, before he started the trade war, with China. Brazil, for example, they and launched an investigation against Brazil, largely for political reasons, because they were, and he said he was going to put 50% tariffs on Brazil because of the way they were treating Bolsonaro in his judicial and in his the independent judiciary, trying to influence the independent judiciary of Brazil, and said that, and actually attacked a number of their digital economy laws, like privacy and protections. And Brazil has not backed down on that so far, and they haven't kind of faced additional, problems. I think, and it's interesting because in the trade agreements, there clearly is a template that they're putting forth, but they aren't all the same. And so you can actually see that some countries, I think, because part of Trump's goal in this is just to get headlines, to look like the deal maker, to, look like, yeah, I mean, being the deal maker, I think, is like one of the big goals around this. And so it doesn't look like they've been so hardline that countries have to agree to every piece of it, because actually the deals they're very short compared to the way trade agreements have typically been in the past. And again, they don't have the same kinds of enforcement mechanisms that we've seen. So so I think there is an element that some countries are agreeing to things that they may not actually do, or saying we're not going to agree to something and then it's not in the deal. Like, for example, I didn't list Guatemala in our on the list because even though there is a deal there, it doesn't have critical minerals elements in it. And I don't know why that's the case. Because El Salvador's doesn't. So I think maybe there was somebody who in the government who said we don't want to do this one, and they're just like, okay. It's unclear because again, we don't have any like sight lines into what's actually happened.
Excellent. Raquel, did you want to add anything?
Nothing specific, but I will say I think it will be very interesting to see how countries, and more specifically regions within countries that already have a lot of established pushback to extraction policies, will handle this. I'm thinking especially of like Panama, for example, where massive protests about a year and a half ago, I want to say, forced the government to cancel a mine that they had backed for many, many years. And I think it will be very interesting, especially since these are non-binding agreements so far, um, to see how existing movements push back on this.
Yes, excellent. I think Brazil is a very good example of the different approaches that the Trump administration has taken. Uh, and it's curious that, so much pressure was put on the Brazilian government while the case was being prosecuted against Bolsonaro. But as soon as Bolsonaro ended up in jail, then suddenly Trump switched over to negotiating with Lula because obviously Trump just likes dealing with winners, and Bolsonaro had become a loser by definition when he was thrown in prison. But we have two very good questions, but before I ask that one, I'll throw mine out there for you to think about, which is, one of the key aspects of Trump's, regional policy towards Latin America is essentially to push China or Chinese influence, Chinese companies out of the region. And China obviously has put a lot of investment into infrastructure for the extraction of minerals and the transport of minerals to ports and the expansion of ports for those minerals to get to China eventually. And a number of countries, including countries that are aligned to the United States, like Argentina, are very close to China in terms of their economic policies. So think about this question of what is the future of China in Latin America, given this pressure that the Trump administration has been pushing through its quote unquote done row policy. But while you think about that, let's go to the second question on our list, which is on deep sea mining, and what the Trump administration has been doing to kind of suction up minerals from the seabed, and the implications for kind of global institutions and global law, such as the International Seabed Authority. So, any thoughts on that?
I will say, it's been, I know I use the word interesting a lot, but it has been very interesting. Because the U.S. is not party to UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. I know so many acronyms, it's absurd. But it is, I think it's an observer, and so it's at all of the meetings. And I have to assume the representatives are, lobbying other representatives and whatnot. And I will not get too into this. We have seen that international law does not have the teeth that many advocates wish it does, especially in the last couple of years. And so I worry that that UNCLOS is going to have decreasing relevance as deep sea mining has increasing possibility. I hope it doesn't happen. I think it will be, I mean, it is objectively going to be wildly destructive at a minimum. Um, I and that's one of the reasons why I think it's so important that when we talk about circular economy, and we talk about minerals in general, we don't just rely on new technologies and new ways of getting minerals, and new places to extract. Because the deep seabed is a new place to extract minerals, and we should not be getting minerals from there. Um, so I think it's really important to emphasize not just technological innovation, which is really important, especially when it comes to recycling and substitution and reuse and repair and all of those things. But new types of extraction should not be the goal here.
Excellent, thank you. Melinda, do you have anything to add
Yeah,
there?
well, I mean, to your question, I mean, again, I feel like it's all big speculation at this point about kind of how this will play out. I mean, it's not just in Latin America. I mean, the DRC deal was also very explicitly about kind of trying the whole idea of the right of first offer of US companies is about trying to push China kind of out of the game, or to, in some of the mining. I mean, I think countries are going to be in a really tough spot, and a government that, in terms of those who are relying on China. Like they don't want to be in a position where they have to only, to say we are aligning with the United States and we will not engage with China but it wasn't even just the Trump administration. The Biden administration was also trying to do that with countries, and I think that countries, particularly in Asia, but also in Latin America, I think we're, basically like playing this kind of tightrope game of how do we appease the United States, but also not make China an enemy, and we need, we're relying on China too. So I don't think that it's like an overnight thing where they'll be like, okay, we're just gonna align ourselves with the US, and particularly because, the US is not a certain partner at all. I mean, Trump is showing that he's, extremely volatile and like will go back on commitments. And so, it doesn't seem like it would be necessarily a really smart move for a lot of governments, even if they are kind of right wing, and allied with Trump, to just do that, because I mean, there's no guarantee that tomorrow he won't wake up and decide to do something else. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. Absolutely. I'm curious what others think about that.
Yeah, I mean, China has put itself forward as the responsible partner to the world today, and many countries which hitherto had not been reaching out to China in such aggressive in such enthusiastic ways. I mean, Canada, obviously, with Mark Carney traveling to Beijing just before the summit in Davos. I recently saw Serbia has reached out in a more enthusiastic fashion to China. So even countries which previously didn't have such strong economic relations are seeing China as
I know. I mean, there's just a lot of. I mean, it's pretty clear that the big winner of Trump's big trade temper tantrums will be China. I mean, because more countries aren't feeling like the United States is a reliable partner. I don't want to overstate that, I think countries are also concerned about the human rights violations in China, and forced labor, all these kinds of things. But in terms of the kind of the stability of the relationship.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And sorry. Do you want to move on?
Go on.
Okay. I wanted to say two things about that. One is that another factor in this is just how wildly China has surpassed expectations in terms of renewable energy deployment. And I know I was just talking about the importance of demand reduction, and I maintain that. But they're deploying solar panels and wind turbines, not to mention EVs, like several orders of magnitude faster than any other country, much less the United States. And if that pace remains, much less if it increases, which I think is possible because some people are saying that China has hit peak emissions already. I think that is going to be a really complicated piece of this as well. And then the second thing was that even beyond this particular administration, I think a lot of countries and even a lot of companies have been really frustrated by the inconsistency of U.S. policies. I think it was in Thea Rio Francos's new book, where she quoted somebody in the EU, the European Commission, saying something like, we can't just be forced to watch what like people in Wisconsin do every 4 years. And so the EU is really known for stability as well, but for better and for worse, I'm not trying to say to like pass judgment on anything right here. China is a so far very stable country in terms of these mineral agreements and their investments and just the supply chain in general. And so from as pure of an economic standpoint as exists, it does make a lot more sense, even beyond this administration. Because like again, they destroyed almost the entire IRA.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. We have a question about recycling of e-waste, and question: is there any attention to this in Trump's policies? And we did a session on waste recycling, and of course the European Union has a target of what they call urban
Mhm.
mining, which is essentially recycling of waste, e-waste, of something like 25%. It's so that eventually it can reduce, at least in theory, the amount of new mining that has to go forward. But Trump, anything, anything in his policies that even remotely gesture in that direction?
Overall, hard no.
Mhm.
I believe, let me put it this way. I would not be surprised if there were occasionally some smaller contracts and loans handed out to recycling companies, especially, of course, if they're connected with the administration. Off the top of my head, I don't know of any. That does not mean they don't exist, though. Um, I recycling was also not prioritized under the Biden administration. They were very much investing in new extraction, new types of extraction, new places of extraction. I will also say that recycling is a very, very important component of reducing extraction in general. It is also not either a one size fits all solution, and it's not a harmless solution either. It can produce a lot of emissions. It can produce a lot of waste and a lot of contaminated water. So as our bedrock environmental laws, like I'm particularly here, the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, as they keep getting gutted, it becomes harder to assume that that recycling is on its own going to be as harmless as we want it to. Again, it's still a really important part. Recycling should still be prioritized. It just has to come with the best environmental and labor standards possible, not just legal.
Mm.
Um,
Excellent.
I mean, I would just mention I agree. I think I mean I don't have them in front of me, but I think there have been some of the memos of understanding that have had like some language related to circular economy. Like so they haven't like completely excised that, but again, kind of in the same boat as we see the labor, some good language on labor standards, there isn't any, indication that that's something that will actually make a difference, in the agreements. That the main point of them is to remove the industrial policy tools and to have the first of refusal. I mean, you can look through and you can see all these like should, or agree to, and then there's like a few shalls, and the shalls, which are the binding commitments, are the ones that the Trump administration, wants to get U.S. access to those minerals.
Mhm.
Excellent. Well, one of the questions everybody has on their mind across the board, all the issues, is how easy is it going to be to rewind some of these policies?
Mhm.
How much of these policies are going to endure because of bipartisan support? And that kind of, I'm going to branch that into two questions for you. Melinda, specifically these trade agreements, are those going to be relative? I mean, we've already seen the Supreme Court strike down his impulsive, Liberation Day tariffs. But how much is it going to be? How easy is it going to be to kind of rewind on those? And then for Raquel, there is a great deal of support for greater mineral independence, as
Yeah.
they say, especially on rare earth elements. And we've reopened our Mountain Pass mine for rare earth elements, exploration of new deposits in the United States. as you said, investments by the government into four rare earth element enterprises. How much of that is going to endure past a Trump administration? So kind of these two sides of this question of the future. And Raquel, I don't know if you want to start off.
Sure. Lots of thoughts on this. Um, I am not trying to be overly cynical when I say I imagine without significant pushback, a lot of this will maintain, even in a Democratic administration. Um, a lot of Trump stuff is abhorrent. Take your pick about what I'm talking about. Um, and similarly, a lot of it is a continuation of longstanding US policies. Like I said earlier in my presentation, um, these quote trade agreements are really, really bad. They're like very nakedly imperialistic. And they're also, I think, a continuation of US policy, a US trade policy in a lot of ways. I'm not trying to make it seem like they're the same. I'm not trying to say that the Trump administration is normal. It's not, and again, in so many ways, but so many of the things that they are doing are I, kind of the end product of things the US has been doing for decades, if not much longer. Um, we did for a time we were one of the world's largest exporters of minerals. And then when it became more profitable to ship it to places with, frankly, lots of poor people and lots of racialized people, we did that because it was cheaper and because it made sense economically and politically. Um, and the impacts didn't change. The impacts got worse. They just didn't happen here. Again, for the most part, there are still mines here. There are still lots of consequences of mining, particularly for indigenous peoples here. Think about uranium mining in particular. Um, and so I think change is possible. We can create a government and a country that is not constantly reliant on extraction, not just on mineral extraction, but also of labor extraction and agriculture and forests and all of this stuff. Like that's possible. Um, but that is going to be a hard change in not just in specific US policies, but in the way the US describes itself, the way the US interacts with other countries. So I will leave it there. Sorry if that was
No,
like
No,
nihilistic.
no, that was very helpful.
no.
Thank you.
Plus, plus, plus to what Raquel said. With the trade agreements in particular, it's I think that because they aren't actually being voted on by Congress, well, I mean, one thing is that we have been pushing Congress to actually say that if you're going to do trade agreements, we have the constitutional authority over this and it must go through Congress. They're clearly not doing that. And obviously, the Republicans in Congress are not holding them accountable for that in a way that they would. I mean, the Biden administration, when they were trying to do executive agreements, there was bipartisan pushback. The Democrats and the Republicans were saying, at least defending their turf. That's not happening, with the Republican majority in Congress now. And so if they're, potentially then they are maybe fairly easy to unwind. I mean, another administration could so much of this has been executive order like focused. And so that could be, executive ordered in the other direction. But I do think that one of the, like, kind of following on to what Raquel said, what's really needed and what my fear is that there is, kind of this knee jerk, Trump's doing it, it's bad when it comes to trade. like when it comes to tariffs or when it comes to even, even some of the industrial policy pieces. And so like this knee jerk, we just need to go back to the free trade neoliberal, no state intervention, laissez-faire, and that from Democrats, and then they end up kind of being again on the side of the elites that, in terms of the politically what led to in the Wisconsin, as you mentioned, Raquel, like where
Yeah.
you see the in important swing states like that was decisive, I think, in a lot of ways, like this kind of that Trump gets to be the populist, where and so there is an opportunity, I think, to try to, if we were able to like mobilize correctly and get the message to the right people, that to oppose Trump and to get democracy back, you have to get this piece right. We have to move away from the, the corporate dominated model that imperialist, that led to the race to the bottom, which means, the hollowing out of manufacturing in the United States, the hollowing out, kind of some of those same things, and that we have to address that in a meaningful way to be able, to win politically. And so those are some of the conversations we've been trying to have. And actually, just to preview, we're going to be having some of those, not so much related to critical minerals, but just in general trade policy in the industrial Midwest to have to get those who are opposing Trump to have a clear position that is a progressive vision for this, as when hopefully there is a time to govern again.
Wait, did you say the Midwest? I'm from Kansas, so that's very exciting. Can I add one more thing to this?
Of course.
Thank you. I think it's important to note that, best case scenario, we come out of these 4 years and we get, a Democratic president or whatever, and they do start trying to, like, as you said, rewind a lot of this stuff. I don't think we should assume that like the original NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act, or the Clean Air Act, or any of those, they weren't perfect then in the 70s when they were written and passed, and they are increasingly inadequate in a lot of ways. Again, they're very important. I'm not saying they're bad, etc. But I really hope that we come out of this time, shall we say, and we have people who are looking forward and looking to try and create better laws, tighter regulations, more protections for communities and environments, more equitable trade with countries, especially global South countries. So I want to caution against assuming that going back to the original bedrock environmental laws should be the goal.
Build back better. Oh, well, I guess someone's already used that phrase. So we'll probably have to figure out a different one. But definitely we could improve on what we've
Yes.
had in place before. We have a question from Sarah Fields, and it goes to both some of your concerns about the relationship between the United States and countries in the global South, but also the relationship between U.S. corporations and communities in the global South. And Sarah wants to know about whether either of your organizations is working on Following Energy Fuels Resources, which is a U.S. firm that's investing in rare earth extraction in Madagascar, as well as it has plans for uranium mill in Utah. And this is something that's dear to our hearts with our Rare Earth Elements group, to foster cooperation among the groups kind of fighting energy fuels both in Madagascar and in the United States. And if you don't have anything specifically to say about that particular firm, you can perhaps talk about more generally the prospects for solidarity work between communities here and communities in the global south who share concerns about the impact of critical mineral extraction and rare earth element extraction in particular. And of course, you mentioned the radioactivity that's associated with a good deal of rare earth extraction. So it adds that additional set of consequences for communities. So I don't know, Melinda, if you wanted to start in and then we'll go to Raquel.
I don't have information about that particular company or situation, so I don't know if you do, Raquel.
I recognize the name, especially in relation to Utah, but we don't work on fuel minerals. Although at this point, maybe we will start working on uranium because it's so intertwined with all of this stuff.
Mhm.
Sarah, if you are still on, I know you're part of the W-Man list. I recognize your name. If you would like me to, like, if you haven't connected with Aaron about this, he's the person I would point you to, and you can email me and I can connect you.
Um, but yeah, I mean, I think generally that's been one of the reports that you can find on our website around cobalt in Congo, nickel in Indonesia. The model that we've been trying to promote is kind of international solidarity with affected communities, bringing the voices of communities that have been affected to policymakers. We've organized with Friends of the Congo. Maurice is on. I see Maurice is here. We've partnered closely with Friends of the Congo to bring delegations of people who have been from Congo, women leaders, to bring their voices to Congress to be pushing back on these things. I believe that there will be a delegation coming from Indonesia. So I think bringing those voices into the conversation and to is critically important, and we want to be supportive however we can be.
Well, Raquel, thank you, Melinda. Raquel mentioned that, one of the reasons we sent our rare earth elements to China for processing, for instance, was lack of environmental regulations and low labor standards and price, of course. It was cheaper to have it processed there. And that was, to a certain extent, fine from the environmentalist point of view in the United States at that time, because it reduced the threat of impact on U.S. communities. When we overseas oppose, the expansion of mining, for instance, in Madagascar or wherever U.S. corporations or other corporations are contemplating or actively extracting minerals, the natural response from a lot of U.S. actors, corporations, as well as the U.S. government, is we have to expand our footprint here in the United States. We have to expand mining, because if we're going to, for whatever reasons, reduce our dependency on overseas supply, then we're going to have to expand our supply here. So how do we address this question? It's basically a kind of a huge NIMBY issue.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
How do we address this question where we balance these concerns of communities, given, of course, we would all like to reduce our overall need for these resources, and that's certainly part of the mix. But at the moment, we can't go from 100 to 0 overnight. So how do we balance these concerns from our point of view, from our organizational point of view?
First of all, what you just said reminded me of when I read an article where someone, I think, with all sincerity, said that the San Carlos Apache tribe was being a NIMBY because they didn't want the Oak Flat mine that would destroy the area that is their connection to God. So, sorry, anyway, that's a really good question. And that's a question whose answer I think will continue to change as our policies change, as technology changes, as things, as conflict changes outside of the US, yeah, we can't go from 100 to 1 despite all of my determination. But I think that, I don't know, I think a lot of people, uh, I'll say from my perspective, I think that most people, the government actors, and the companies that are saying we have to onshore stuff to secure supply, they are not, of course, acting, in my view, in good faith. They're acting out of the interests of their, in the politicians' cases, usually their donors and their friends, and in the companies' cases, their shareholders. I don't think there's anything controversial about that. That's just how those two groups work. Um, so to a certain extent, I agree. I hate that this is recorded. Um, but even from an emissions standpoint, transporting this stuff to multiple countries, multiple continents, is bad. It generates a lot of emissions. I don't think there are any numbers out there. Well, let me say it again. I have not seen any specific numbers, and that is in large part because of how opaque these supply chains are. So transparency is a huge part of this. A lot of companies are intentionally very cut off from their downstream actors because they know there are human rights violations. It's a liability thing. But I do not think that it is, I don't think and I'll say like environmental groups, public interest groups, like civil society in general, I don't think we should accept that argument that quote, we have to onshore things. First of all, I mean, natural disasters and other supply chain disruptions can still happen, especially in a country as big as the United States. And second of all, the people making those decisions will never be impacted by the mines or the processing or the tailings or the pollution from the manufacturing facilities or any of that. It really should not be their decision. That's why things like free, prior, and informed consent, excuse me, exist, even if they are not adequately implemented anywhere. And so I think that even as we're talking about reshuffling supply chains with the intention of reducing the possibility of disruptions, reducing emissions, increasing transparency, reducing human rights violations, those are, again, all important things to do, and people are working on them with many different motives. But I think at the heart of it, we need to be, plan long-term thinking about how we reduce our dependence on these things in general. A really good example is just increasing mobility options, because that will massively reduce our dependence on most critical minerals at this point.
Excellent. Thank you. Melinda.
I think Raquel did a great job with that question.
Because I
Excellent.
listened to your presentation.
Excellent. Okay, so we got a few minutes left. I want to give you both an opportunity to comment on any topic we haven't had a chance to address or address each other. And if you have nothing that's foremost in your mind, I'll return to that initial question I had, which is about industrial policy and whether countries that are being constrained in some way through these agreements are pursuing industrial policy under different names.
Socialism for socialism for me,
And
not for the.
what we yes, exactly. And whether we'll also see a kind of collective industrial policy, aka a cartel approach. Indonesia, of course, discussed at a certain point the possibility of a nickel cartel without getting very far, and then the price of nickel fell. But whether cartel options and for minerals and for countries that are the major producers of specific minerals might continue to look at that in the future, and what the U.S. approach might be to that.
Well, as I mentioned in my presentation, and this is something we don't know much about or how it could look, but there is a discussion that the administration has started about this plurilateral critical minerals deal. Um, and and we're talking about having a price floor mechanism among a block for to have and to have the kind of a block of secure-ish supply chains for critical minerals, which is different than a cartel thing that I know that you're discussing. But it's interesting because we didn't weigh in about like the mechanism of for that as a coalition, partially because I think we hadn't really weren't sure what we'd think, because you could imagine something that could be beneficial, that would be, where if you were able to say, we have all agreed that we're going to have high standards, high human rights standards. We're going to have enforcement mechanisms for companies that don't abide by them. We're going to, and we're going and we've kind of created a club that of countries that are willing to do that, and you would need to also have technology transfer, and financing from global north to global south to do something like that. I'm sure that is not remotely what is, on the table, but I think, but I feel like that's kind of the direction that we need to go in terms of thinking about the green transition, like, could be an opportunity to think of industrial policy jointly, that this isn't like an industrial policy that the United States does ours, the other countries do. There obviously we have way more resources to be able to do that. And when you asked about if countries are doing industrial policy in different ways, I mean, the problem is that for countries that don't have the fiscal space that the United States has, like, export restrictions are really kind of one of the only games they have. Like, they can't subsidize, they can't, like, do the tax incentives and all those kinds of things. So I mean, I think there is a real danger that that the global north does industrial policy and the global south doesn't. And that would be and so can we think about industrial policy? I mean, like Marshall Plan style, right? Which is like we kind of develop together. We are, recognize that there's benefit for various countries in the supply chain to be able to produce various pieces of it, and we think about how we use state support to do that, and so that's I feel like there's some exciting possibilities there down the road, but obviously right now we just have to fight all the bad stuff. So I'll leave it there.
Right. Excellent. Thank you. Raquel.
I will say, um, I am often very overwhelmed by how bad things seem. Hot take. Nobody else feels this way, I'm sure. And that very much includes the professional stuff I work on, the critical minerals and stuff. It is hard to imagine uh, stuff changing. But there's a but here. Um, this is such a critical pivot point, is how I've been thinking of it. In so many, like, choose your way in which this is a pivot point, and that's right. But in like this is there's no silver lining to global warming, but I do think this possibility of transition is such an incredible opportunity and such a gift, because we have, I mean, for the first time ever since maybe the Industrial Revolution, we have the opportunity to completely reshape how we produce and consume energy. And the ripple effects from that are could completely reshape the world. I mean, there's a possibility, no matter how small and no matter how faint right now, that in 50 and 100 and 200 years from now, there is if not just less inequality between the global north and global south, there is actual equality. There's a very real possibility like the world does find a way to not produce greenhouse gas emissions, um, where we have a clean water for everyone and clean air isn't in doubt. And the public health consequences of that are enormous. And then, from there, gender stuff and everything. Um, and no matter how frustrated and upset, and as I was describing to John and Melinda earlier, no matter how deeply I feel like we are in one of the circles of hell, I do so like this is possible technologically, economically, whatever. And I think it is important to maintain that, as we're even as we're just reading all of this nonsense, much less actually like uh, feeling these consequences. One of somebody I really admire, is an abolitionist named Miriam Kaba, and she has this quote that I think of often, which is "Hope is a discipline." And so I'm deep in the climate space, and I really try to maintain that. And I say that as somebody who has never blessedly experienced any of the impacts of extraction. So it is, I think, we those of us who have never felt those impacts have a responsibility to keep trying. Sorry to get preachy. This is just something I've been.
No, that's perfect. And after, an hour and a half of largely doom and gloom, it's
Yeah.
really important to have a ray of hope. And in my more pessimistic moments, I think, well, the reason why the Trump administration is doing what it is doing so quickly and so desperately is because it realizes that it's up against enormous opposition
Yes.
from communities around the world, and it's trying to roll things back as quickly as it can. But frankly, as we have talked about today, and given the fact that we have extraordinary people like you both who are working on these issues, they will fail.